So good morning, everybody, and good afternoon, depending on where you are coming from. So we'll be starting very shortly, and I just want to make a few announcements. So this meeting is all about clinical research, and as we know, research is very, very important. And one thing we've noticed is that a lot of people want to do research, but they are not sure of how to do research, and they are not sure of how to start. It's almost like, how do I even start research? Maybe the last research you did was a group project in a community health project, whatever it is. But now you're going to speak to an expert how to even get into clinical research. What are the things that you can do that will make it easy for you to get into research? And that's what we'll be talking about today in this meeting. And before we go into it, Chinaza is going to give a brief profile of our guest speaker today. So Chinaza, you have the floor now.
Oh, hi everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Chinaza, and I'll be giving the profile on Dr. Ibraheem Abioye. So Dr. Abioye is a physician and public health professional with more than 10 years experience in clinical research and project management. He's proficient in evidence generation strategy using epidemiology and health economics, and prides himself in being a highly analytical and detail-oriented problem solver. He graduated from Lagos State University in 2007, where he was the Director of Reproductive Health and AIDS for the Nigerian Medical Students Association, as NIMSA. He went on to bag a master's in Public Health from Harvard University School of Public Health. He completed his postdoctoral fellowship in Global Health Epidemiology and Nutrition at Harvard as well. He has used his skills to partake in multiple research projects, acting as a clinical trial monitor and project manager in projects conducted by Harvard's C.H. Chan School of Public Health. He is a HEOR Fellow for Novartis Oncology and is currently a PhD candidate at Harvard University. He currently runs the START Clinic, a consulting and training service for clinical and public health epidemiology. So you guys join me as I welcome Dr. Ibraheem Abioye.
You're welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for that profile. And thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak with all of you. So the way that I hope that we will spend the next 30 minutes to 1 hour is I will first of all give you a brief introduction about myself, and then I will go through a number of concepts. So I organized a bit about how to focus this talk, because it really depends on where each person is at where you're starting from. And so I try to identify the factors that I believe that will be important to anyone who is venturing into clinical research, regardless of where you're starting from. So what I'll do is that I'll go through a number of concepts, and those concepts, I hope that they will help us to initiate a conversation, and then we can then go into a question and answer session where you can ask whatever comes to your mind, whether we have talked about it or not. So rather than talk to you about design in detail, I will rather talk to you about the more the broader issues that are important across all of research, and then we can take it from there. So in terms of my research experience, basically, I have been a researcher every day since I graduated medical school. I published my MBBS thesis. So the project that we do as part of the thesis at LASCOM, we do a single project. I know some schools do projects in groups, but at LASCOM, each person will do one project, and I was able to publish 2 papers from my thesis, from my project, and So one of them was published in Nigerian Journal, and the other was published in African Health Sciences. So that was really an interesting experience for me. Basically, figuring out what research question would make sense to ask. I did not want to do the typical KAP studies that people were doing. I wanted to do something that would really advance the learning, that would be useful and that would get published. So I set out with the goal that if I was going to do a thesis, if I was going to do this project, it had to be publishable, you know. So and I was able to get 2 papers out of that work. During my house job, you know, I started to wonder to myself, what would I do when I finish house job? What would a career be? Actually, that's something that we all agonize over since medical school, right? You know, would I see patients? If I do see patients, what specialty would I work in? And I always thought that I would become a surgeon, you know, and so I started to try and figure out what are the factors that make for a good surgeon. You know, what are the factors that make it more likely that people who were starting out their careers will want to stay in surgery, you know. But at that point, I was beginning to already wonder about surgery at all. You know, I wasn't feeling the my experience as a surgical intern, you know, and so I did this study where I had spoken to house officers, residents, and asked them about residents, actually surgical residents, and asked them about their interest in surgery. And I collaborated with a consultant surgeon for this paper and another public health physician who is now a professor actually at Lasicom. And so we have a paper from that work. You know, but for me, that paper was interesting because I didn't do it because I wanted to add to my career. I did it because I was curious about this set of questions, and I wanted to find answers to them. You know, so that's another reason why people typically do research. You know, you have a question, you want to answer it, you want to understand, and that's why I did that. Then I went to NYSC. During NYSC, I thought that I would collect the cases that are seen in camp clinic and publish a sort of profile of what typical camp clinic would look like. What are the cases that are seen? What are the treatments that are done? But ultimately, so we collected all the data, and we didn't get to publish it because by the time I was finishing NYC, I was beginning to have new understanding of research, ethics of research, and all of that was becoming clearer to me. And so I kind of knew that data wasn't collected with consent and all that, so I had to just burn everything and put it away. The same thing, I also collected routine clinical cases during NYC, basically asking patients about their lower urinary tract symptoms, collecting their BMI, basically going beyond what was routine clinical care, because I was curious about, I was seeing a lot of people who were overweight and obese, and I was doing my NYC in a rural area, you know, so I was, and this was far back in 2010, yeah, and so that kind of got me sick, and I was wondering, why is there so much overweight and obese if this is rural, you know? So that I wanted to try to understand that part of it, and that was before there's now been global understanding that chronic disease risk factors are becoming more common in lower middle income countries. You know, in 2010, if you said that there was obesity in rural Nigeria, people didn't take you seriously. You know, so essentially, all throughout my career, I've talked about the early years, but then since finishing NYC, I did my MPH at Harvard. I interned at an NGO in Ghana, and I had the opportunity to do some research there as well. And then after completing my MPH, I started to work at Harvard. We had a series of projects actually in Tanzania, and so I moved to Tanzania and lived there for 3 to 4 years, helping to lead clinical trials. You know, so essentially, I discovered that I really like doing research, and I have spent all of my life doing that. And currently I work in a pharmaceutical company. I used to work at Novartis, and then I moved. But my current role is still research, epidemiology, health economics, outcomes research. Very exciting stuff, and I'm looking forward to completing my PhD very soon. So I hinted at this a few seconds ago. I said, why do people do research? Out of curiosity or to answer certain questions. I've talked about my own experience with this, where I've been curious about questions. I know some of you might be curious about the patients that you're seeing. I was curious about why there was overweight and obesity in rural Egbe, in Kogi State. And so I set to answer the question. And I think that would have been a very interesting paper if I did get to publish it. But yeah, that's one reason why people do research. But for the most part, for most people actually do research to advance science and learning, to publish in high impact journals, to advance your career. These are the reasons why most people do research. On top level, we're all mercenaries, you're either you're seeing patients and helping to bring care to them, to make them healthier, or you're doing research, or whatever you're doing. At some point, you want to get paid doing what you love, and that's always important to bear in mind. The reason why people do research would help you. The reason why you're doing your research will help you to define what kind of studies that you would work on, and how you will go about designing your studies, how you will go about whether you will publish them or not. So if you're curious about questions and you want to do a rigorous study to understand certain things, you might not need to publish. You might write a report that gets distributed within your department. That's still research. It doesn't have to necessarily be published in a high impact journal. However, there are some important skills that leading investigators have, and basically what I'm hoping to do during the next 30 minutes or so is essentially walk you through what some of these skills are, and then let you see how you would develop those skills, point you to things that you will to resources that might help you as you figure out your interest in clinical research. Okay, so when I was putting together these slides yesterday, I was curious who are the leading investigators in Nigeria. So I went on Google Scholar and found that the top 4 researchers were in one of the published papers were highlighted as being the researchers with the highly cited, the most highly cited scholars, if you use the H index, and we can talk about what that means if you're interested. But then citations are not everything in research. Sometimes the way that we define who the highly cited, who the leading investigators are, also which investigators are getting the best grants, which investigators are getting the highest value grants, and which investigators are doing the best work that the society recognizes. Those are some other parameters that are used to identify leading investigators. But all of these leading investigators do a few things very well. Ask great questions, write well, design studies correctly to answer the questions that they're interested in, and plan great analysis. So you have to be able to do all this to do good clinical research. You don't necessarily have to do, there's so many other things that you will need to do to accomplish a clinical research paper, but you don't necessarily have to be great at all of those other things. You might be, which is good, but these are the 4 parameters that are like very fundamental. If you struggle with any of these 4, then you need to find resources to help you to improve, so that you can have a chance at becoming a great investigator yourself. Asking questions. So this is a very underrated skill, and it's something that as clinicians shouldn't be much of a problem, because part of our training is that you have to collect the patient, right? So the way to think about it is that you have this research question, you want to click it. This is one way that I will describe you. This is the question. You begin to try to figure out what the parameters are, what the extents are, what are the gaps. So you can think about it as an investigation to figure out stuff, right? And these are some of the key things that every time you talk about questions, places to start from: who, what, when, where, why. This is something that journalists are really crazy about. What story do you want to tell? So when we're thinking about clinical research, you're not typically thinking about it as a story, but in the end, when you develop your research report, you have to be able to tell the story in a way that people who are listening to you, people who are reading your work, will be able to relate with it, to be able to ask the right questions, to be able to take the evidence that you've generated and take it further. So this is why asking questions is really critical. And so I'll talk to you about some of the things that you would need to do when you want to start in a clinical research area, and you're trying to figure out what questions should I be asking, how should I ask my questions. Probably everybody knows that if you want to go into a research area, or at least you would think that everybody would know that when you're starting on a new new research subject, you should first of all read the papers that are in that area. You'll be surprised that too many people jump into a research question or jump into a research study without first of all looking at what else have people done in this area. Because if you review what others have done in the area of interest for your research, then it would allow you to understand what's there, how would you be able to improve upon the work, identify the gaps that exist, ask the right questions, so what the work that you do will be truly novel, and you'll be able to craft the correct research agenda. Sometimes also a literature review would help you to understand the methodologic approaches that are in use in your field. So when you're starting out on research, one of the things that we agonize over is how do I design my study? How do I analyze it? And today I want to tell you that the first thing you want to do is find a paper that looks like the paper you want to write. Then write that paper. Basically find a paper that looks very similar to what you want to write. Look at the way that they have conducted their study. Look at the design that they have employed. Look at the analysis that they have done, and then follow that. Basically, there's some degree of craftsmanship. Think about yourself as an apprentice. An apprentice is you're going to build a chair. You essentially look at the way that the next person who is maybe your boss or whatever, the way that person is building their own chair, or the way that person has built the chair in the past, and then you build your chair like that. It's not something that a lot of people realize, but in reality, all of us who do research, we follow what others have done and then do ours. There's a line to cross, however, where in copying what others have done, then you move into plagiarism. And we'll talk about plagiarism in a few minutes. But first of all, do a very good literature review. It doesn't have to be exhaustive, but it has to identify the most important papers in a space. And one of the ways that you do that is that you first of all look for published review papers. So if you are going to look at a question in, a lot of my research is in anemia, for instance, and so if you wanted to understand anemia in the context of HIV, so you would type in Google Scholar anemia HIV review, and you would most likely find a few papers that are like systematic reviews that will have detailed information about what has been published at a particular point. It could be maybe 2018, 2019, and that gives you a sort of timeline. So you know that you first of all read everything. If you read the systematic review in detail, it helps to get up to speed. And then you can then look at the papers that have been published since the systematic review. What other new work is interesting, and read those as well. So that's a typical way that you will do is a fairly targeted review that will help you get up to speed. So it's not one literature review, of course, that you would read. You would read multiple reviews because very often research papers are looking at the same series of questions from different angles. You know, one person might be looking at the diagnostics, one person might be looking at the biomarkers that are involved, one paper might be looking at the clinical course, you know, one paper might be looking at the epidemiology. So you would read that broad set of reviews, and then that way you have a grounding in that research subject, and then take it from there. If you have questions at any point in time, please feel free to stop me. My hope is that this is going to be more like a discussion than a dump of ideas. Also, if you want me to clarify anything at any point in time, please. The other thing that's important to understand in asking questions is that you want to ask a question that is comprehensive enough that allows you to identify all the parameters of that question. So what is the population of interest? What is the intervention or the exposure? That should be exposure, sorry. What are the comparators and what's the outcome? You know. So this PICO framework is an important framework that people use all over the world to sort of set the bar, like this is the lower limit of what a research question should look like. So in thinking about your research, you have to identify these 4 parameters of that question, and then you can take it from there. Because if you're looking at a question that's too broad, then you could get lost. So if you're looking at anemia and HIV, for instance, there's tons and tons of papers. But if you decided that you want to look at anemia, which is the exposure, and then HIV outcomes, you know, and then you want to look at maybe the population of interest. The other thing that I want to tell you about is DAGs. So DAGs are directed acyclic graphs. If you take an epidemiology degree today, you'll most likely learn about DAGs. They have become an important tool that epidemiologists use to lay out research questions, you know. And it's essentially you have one parameter and another one. Sorry, let me just use a pointer so you can see. Okay, so here you have, this is A is the exposure and Y is the outcome. You know, so this is the basic thing of any clinical research. Any clinical research that you're looking at will have at least 2 parameters, right? And if it's an epidemiology, if it's an epidemiologic question, you will probably have more parameters. We talked about the PICO framework a moment ago. Okay, so if you want to do a study that looks at the risk of stroke among patients with hypertension, you would draw a DAG that looks like this. Hypertension leads to stroke, you know. Or you might want to understand how lisinopril modifies hypertension and lowers stroke risk, for instance. You know, so you would have a sort of chain that looks like this. And you can take it a notch further and then begin to introduce other parameters. So for instance, a patient's income will affect whether they can afford to buy lisinopril, but their income might also be associated with the risk of stroke, you know. And so you begin to then layer upon other parameters of your research question in this manner. And yeah, this is a confounder, by the way. This is the way that confounders are identified in research. You know, that helps you to lay it out, and you can see how the relationships are, you know, and then understanding that those relationships will help you to define your question carefully. It will also help you to understand when the limitations of your research, you know. So if you looked at how lisinopril is related to stroke, for instance, one person might tell you that, oh, you didn't consider the income, you know. So if you're just focused on this DAG and you didn't introduce income into your relationship, you would have an imperfect research question, so to speak. Okay? And so one further thing that you will then do is think about, how do I study this question of lisinopril or to reduce the risk of stroke while also considering income? You know, and this is basically an entire set of this is an entire course in epidemiology where what are the different ways of adjusting for confounders and all of that. Okay. Questions? No questions at this point. All right. So I also said that research is writing, right? So you need to be able to write properly. So I'm sort of changing gears here a bit. So you need to be able to write properly. First of all, you want to know what you want to research. Then you have to write a proposal. First draft, you have to, when you do your analysis, you want to be able to write the results in a way that is easy to follow and that is appropriate. You know, then you also have to write your discussion section and your abstract. Yeah, each of these sections have unique characteristics. If you don't know, if I don't know what type of research that you're particularly doing, I may not be able to give you as much information on, oh, this is what you're going to do. But what I will do in the next set of slides is give you sort of like a flavor of what are the things that are important for some of these parameters. Okay. So the introduction section is basically a fundamental part of any research paper, right? Whatever you're going to write, you're going to write an introduction section. And a lot of people struggle with introduction sections. Every time I review a paper, you see the challenges that people have with writing the introduction section. So I want to introduce you a very simple framework for writing introduction section. It's called the inverted pyramid. You start with a very broad research question. So maybe you're looking at anemia and HIV. You write about the things that everybody agrees on as far as this question is concerned. So typically this will be the epidemiology. You help you to set the significance of the question. Say, just tell the person that I want to tell you about something. It is so important. You have to pay attention to what I want to tell you about. HIV is killing so many people all over the world. Well, in spite of the fact that we have antiretroviral therapy, so many people are still dying. Listen, basically, you're forcing the person's attention. That's the first thing that you want to do with the introduction section. So typically, I will do this in 3 paragraphs and no more, unless it becomes absolutely necessary. Do I write an introduction section that is longer than 3 paragraphs? So, you write 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph is telling the person, pay attention, I want to tell you about something that's very important. And in this paragraph, there's nothing that's controversial. You're just talking about things that everybody agrees with, And then in the second paragraph, you begin to highlight the research gaps, the parts of the research question that are controversial. We talk about them here. And then the next paragraph will talk about what do you want to do about it. This is what I want to study. This is my research question, the aims and objectives of my research. Now, this framework that I've introduced to you, this is not a framework for if you wanted to write a project for your residency, for instance. That dissertation. This is not the approach. This is an approach for if you're writing the introduction section for a research paper that gets published. Okay. Again, an inverted pyramid starts with the most important aspects, broad, no controversy, then highlight the gaps in the second paragraph, and talk about how you're going to fill those gaps in the third paragraph, basically. So I'll just skip this because I already gave examples. So I talked about this earlier. If you're going to write the method section of your research paper, find the paper that has done what you want to do and was published in a good journal, then write what they did in your own words. If something works, don't try to reinvent it. Of course, you also need to learn the methods. You also need to know the methods to be able to use them. So if you find a paper that has done something that you want to do, you have to understand what they did. That means that if they had used regression methods, you have to understand the regression methods before you can be able to deploy it. Otherwise, it will show in the writing that that whoever wrote the method section did not really know what they were doing. If this is a clinical case that you're writing up, you have to find a good clinical case that has been published in a great journal, maybe New England Journal of Medicine, for instance, and then write your paper based on that good paper. You know, that gives you a good chance of getting your paper into a good journal as well. Plagiarism is another key point that we have to bear in mind. In a lot of papers that are published, there's a lot of plagiarism. You might find that papers are referencing works without citing them. However, if you do something like that and you're working at, say, a top school, for instance, or a top university, plagiarism can basically ruin careers. You know, you don't want to do that. Also, plagiarism can make it less likely that your paper is going to be taken seriously. And the fix of plagiarism is actually very simple. You know, essentially, you can learn how to cite properly. How to cite properly is part of it's part of the things that are important to understand if you're going to write good clinical research, right? But let me tell you about a very simple framework for avoiding plagiarism in your research. First of all, you read an article and you want to reference it in your paper. You close that article, you paraphrase or summarize what you read in your own words, and then add the correct citation. So typically what I will do is that, so I typically have these yellow pages that I, like a jotter or something like that. And so when I read a paper, I summarize what I'm reading in my words. You know, close it and then look away from the paper and then summarize it and add the citation to that jotter. You know, so I can come back to it anytime later and I can be able to reference it. The important thing that I want to also bear in mind is citing while you write. You know, so very often people want to wait and say, oh, I will cite it later. Don't do that, because as your work becomes more complicated, you're likely to mix up citations. And if you're mixing up citations, that's also plagiarism. It's not necessarily that you didn't cite at all or you didn't reference the paper at all, but citing improperly can also get you in trouble. You know, and there are free software that are available that will help you to do it. If you can use Microsoft Word, you can use Mendeley, you know. So we have no excuses for not doing our citations correctly. And with this software, you don't have to cram how to cite, how to reference, how to organize your citation. Basically, the software will lead you on how you will do it. You know, there's also YouTube videos that will show you how to just quickly get into using any of these softwares. I recommend it. Okay. Typically, one thing that I'll do is that if I'm writing long articles, I will use whatever citation style is convenient for me. I would usually use author year citation if it's like a very long article, because then it's easier for me to track. Also, because I have worked in this space that I'm researching for a long time, I kind of know the authors that I'm citing. You know, some of them I've met in person. So you're citing this work, so you know that this is this person, that person, this person's work, that person's work. It's easier for me to follow than if I were using numbers. You know, what's that number? So once I'm done with doing all the citation, then once I'm done with doing all of the writing, then I will then change the citation style to the style that the journal would want. You know, and this is also easy to do if you're using the software. I also want to talk to you about writing decent paragraphs. I know that I'm changing gears a lot, and I'm hoping that at the end of this period, we'll be able to talk briefly about any of the things that I've talked about. Okay. I also want to tell you about writing decent paragraphs. So very often we think, oh, I've been writing since I was born, right? Which is true. But a research paper is essentially a series of arguments that you're making. You've done your study, you've found, or you encountered a patient in the clinic and you think that this is a unique case, you want to write it up. Oh, and by the way, clinical cases, they're harder to publish, especially because you need to demonstrate that this is a paper, this is a clinical case that's truly unique, you know. So some of the things that you want to do is present an argument for why this is important for whoever is reading it to bear in mind, you know. And if you're writing a paper, you're writing multiple paragraphs. Each of them is an argument, and very often the preferred strategy is that each paragraph should focus on one set of ideas. So you're not modeling off so many things so that it's difficult to follow. Because there are exceptions to this rule. So for instance, you're writing the limitation section of your research paper. Very often it's a list of limitations that you're just explaining, right? That's different from early in your discussion section, for instance, where you're making the case that anemia leads to an increased risk of death in HIV patients, for instance, you know. So if you're looking at a research question like that, you first of all want to present a claim. The claim is the position that you're making based on the evidence that you have. So you're saying anemia increases the risk of mortality, right? And then the reason is, why do you say that? So this is still an explanation of that claim, you know, that gives it more in some more flowery language, some more explanation of what that claim is based on. But also you then provide evidence. So typically evidence will be, there's some previous paper that has also looked at this, or in this paper that we just did, this is what we found. That's the evidence that you want to present. But also as part of that same paragraph, you want to make sure that you acknowledge objections and alternatives or questions that other people might have. So you're seeing that anemia leads to, okay, so for instance, let me give you a question that many people might be able to relate with. So for instance, anemia increases the risk of HIV, right? But if you do a study where you provide iron to patients who have HIV, iron supplements, and then you're looking to see if the iron supplements reduces the risk of death, you know, some people might tell you that it's not the iron supplements, it's because they really didn't have anemia in the first place. Or if the iron supplements do not work, it might be because the anemia was just so severe that the iron supplements did not really work. You know, so these are questions that other people might have that you have to acknowledge in your paper and say, oh, there might be this other sets of arguments, but this is what we think. So you have, after acknowledging those arguments, you have to then present a response to those arguments. You know, so this is an interesting framework that I think people should bear in mind. There's this book, The Craft of Research, that the name of that book will cause you to think that the book is about research design. No, it's not actually about research writing. You know, and it's a very good book. I recommend it. But that book, this is one of the key principles that the book teaches. Basically, every paragraph, different paragraph should have a claim, a reason, evidence for that claim, an acknowledgement of questions, objections, and alternatives, and then how did you respond to them? Okay, so study designs. I'm not going into much detail. I just wanted to say here that there's multiple different types of study designs, you know, and each study design has its own unique characteristics. There are the observational studies and interventional studies. There's also the quasi-experimental studies. Now, the interventional study is basically simple. You intervene on something. So you might either intervene as part of clinical care, in which case they're just describing what happened, or you might intervene as part of an experimental, say, an experimental study like a randomized control trial. You know, or you might just be observational studies where you're not intervening, you're just describing relationships, like in cohort studies or case control studies. Or there might be quasi-experimental studies. So, for instance, quasi-experimental studies are a group of studies that we have not really seen so much in clinical medicine, but I think that they have very unique features and that more people should be looking into them. So, for instance, you think about, say, at your hospital, there is a new intervention that the hospital department has introduced. That might be that, say, let's say it's a surgical department, for instance. It might be that there is a new routine for how patients are closed after surgery. You could design it as a trial where you randomly assign patients to be closed in this way or not. But that's not always possible. Sometimes you cannot change who gets what. But you want to be able to design the study and make sure that you can demonstrate the effect of that intervention. So quasi-experimental studies can help you do that. So an example of a quasi-experimental study is a difference in difference study. Where you find one group that got the intervention, another group that got the intervention, evaluate them at the beginning and at the end. One group that got the intervention, another group that did not get the intervention. Evaluate both groups at the beginning and at the end and look at the difference between the groups at each time point. This will allow you to actually demonstrate causal inference and show that this actually works. A lot of people do not realize that these are valid methodologies that we could use. These methodologies are more often used today in economics and in social sciences, but they're really good if you think carefully about the limitations and you can apply them to clinical medicine as well. So we have a program that we are putting together, Start Clinic, where we hope to be able to offer classes that will help health professionals get started in research. But I think that what we really want to be able to do is identify very important methods that we can teach. Earlier in the year we taught systematic reviews and meta-analysis, and we hope to still teach that course again later in the year. But we have identified a series of methods that we think are critical, and we will announce as time goes on, how we will go ahead to teach them, when people can be able to enroll and all of that. Some of the discussions that we're having is class size to ensure that people can be able to get the best out of the sessions, or should we have a cohort of people who are taught all these methods, or should we let people come into whatever method that they want to learn or not? So these are some of the questions that we're still trying to figure out. This is my last slide, and basically I want to leave you with a few thoughts, and that is that collaborate. So a lot of us do not realize that collaborations are how good research is done. You cannot know everything. Many of us who are clinicians, for instance, are not great at analysis. We're not great at statistics. You might think we are, but every time that, even now that I engage with a PhD statistics person or a professor of statistics, I learn multiple new things that I take back to my research. So I would say that if you're going to do good work, find excellent collaborators, talk to people who have done the type of analysis you think your work will need, reach out to your statistician or math friend. And this is one thing that we do not do enough in Nigeria, in African settings. You're doing work in the medical school, but we're closeted. There are people in the math department just down the street who can do all of this analysis very well, and some of them are great at coding in R, in Python. But if we don't engage them, we will not be able to get the benefits of having that talent. The thing to note when you're working with people who have not previously had, people who are not clinicians, is that there needs to be some degree of hand-holding. You will need to help them to understand what each variable is. You need to help them to understand what a data set is, because different types of variables have different ways that you would analyze them. Also, there's different questions have the things that make the most sense, so you have to work closely with them. You don't just say, oh, this is the data, go and go analyze it, and then just give me the results. No, for you to get the best out of it, like I said at the top of the hour, think about the story you want to tell. So the story you want to tell will help you to craft your research paper, will help you to design the methods that you're going to use, will help to define the analysis that are going to be incorporated. But it's good to learn the methods and to be able to do them. But the most important thing that a good investigator knows how to do is design the analysis, is know that, oh, this is a continuous variable. We're going to need this type of analysis here. We're going to need these types of graphs. This is what we want to demonstrate. These are potential confounders that we need to deal with. You don't have to be the one who does the coding yourself. You can find people who can code in R, who can code in whatever software, and work with them. It's something that people should bear in mind. But you have to be able to design it yourself and be able to know what needs to actually get done. Thank you very much. I'll take questions if you have any questions, and I hope you do.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. Dr. Abioye, that was an extremely informative, enjoyable, and valuable session.